and we're really excited to welcome Kathy Kelly to speak today on tonight's webinar. I'm Anna. I'm a member of the Raytheon Anti-War Coalition and Campaign, which is a coalition of various organizations in the Boston area working together to expose and put pressure on Raytheon's role in the war in Yemen. So we do that through various means. We write op-eds, we do rallies, we create presentations. So there's a variety of different ways to get involved in this important work. I want to invite anyone who's interested in this work to get involved. We have a couple of things coming up in particular. The first is that we've got a rally against Raytheon and its role in Yemen on August 15th, which is a Saturday. It's, I believe, 1 week from this Saturday, and it'll be at 11 a.m. in Davis Square. So please join us for that if you are available. We'll be wearing masks and social distancing so as not to spread the virus and whatnot. So that's one event coming up. The next is our coordinating meeting, which is roughly once a month. The next one is on Monday, the 17th of August at 5:30 p.m. And if you're interested, we'll follow up about this with a link that you can join where we discuss various events that we're planning, different initiatives, different strategy, tactics for our campaign against Raytheon. So those are two upcoming events. Davis Square, where is Davis Square? I believe it's in Somerville?
It is.
Great, okay, good. Somerville, so thank you for that question, Janice. The last thing is that we have a campaign presentation which gives an overview of the situation in Yemen and the work that we're doing that we're really hoping to share with other groups. Thank you, Janice. Boston, Massachusetts is where the broader area that we operate. So Somerville is also in Massachusetts. Did I get everything geographically right? I hope.
How do you read all those things at the same time you're talking, Anna?
It just popped up. Anyways, okay, great. So if you're interested or if there are any other groups that you work with that would like to just learn about the campaign, we're happy to coordinate with you and schedule a time to present that to you and host a discussion on what our campaign is doing, how we can work together, if that's something you're interested in, any of the above. So that's a brief overview of what we're doing here in Massachusetts, but I'm going to turn it over to Paul Shannon, who's going to introduce Kathy Kelly and discuss kind of the overview of the webinar. So take it away, Paul.
Thanks very much, Anna, and welcome everybody. For tonight, I just wanted to mention that we will not be dealing with questions in chat. We will be asking you to raise your hand. You'll notice if you go to participants at the bottom of that, or actually midway down, there's an option to say raise hand. And when you raise your hand, once we get to question and answers, Brian will unmute you so you can ask your question in person. But tonight, as just about everyone on the call knows, Kathy, of course, is founder of the Voices for Creative Nonviolence, which is the successor group of the Voices in the Wilderness. But for those who don't know Kathy, I want to give you a sense of how lucky we are to have this remarkable speaker with us this evening. Kathy, of course, is from Chicago, and in 1978, she started working in a soup kitchen there. And in that process, developed relationships with this amazing group of Catholic peace activists in that area. And from there, of course, there was absolutely no holding her back. Kathy has been arrested for nonviolent civil disobedience 60 times. She has visited war-torn countries dozens and dozens of times. Iraq, Pakistan, Haiti, Bosnia, Afghanistan, Lebanon, Gaza, and that's only a few of the countries that she has visited in her work for peace. Kathy doesn't just work against war. She goes to where the war is and spends time there with victims under the bombs. She was there during shock and awe in Iraq. She was there during Operation Cast Lead in Gaza. Kathy doesn't just work against sanctions, she breaks them, personally delivering aid 26 times to the children of Iraq in direct violation of US law under President Clinton, who was trying to starve the population of Iraq into submission from 1996 to 2003, leading to the death of 500,000 children, which in turn led to the resignation of 2 United Nations officials in charge of Iraq at the time. Kathy doesn't just create peace movements in the United States, she creates them in other countries, especially her work with the Afghanistan Peace Volunteers. Of course, most of her work does take place here. There isn't anything she hasn't done. What I found very interesting was her planting corn on top of the Minuteman missile silos in Missouri. So she's a farmer too. Kathy is an author. The name of her book, and I love this title, is Other Lands Have Dreams. Other Lands Have Dreams. So that's Kathy's book. We all want to hear Kathy, but I just want to let you know that this is only the beginning of the remarkable activities of Kathy Kelly. So Kath, I just want to let you know that so you understand how fortunate we are that Kathy is taking time to spend with us all this evening. And Kathy, thank you very much, and we'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for that introduction, Paul. And I was looking forward to this very much. It's wonderful to see so many people gathered together. And I'm especially grateful to Anna and Brian and Paul, not only for this webinar, but also I was joking with them earlier saying, I've been wondering what is in your Cheerios out there in Boston, because you've done such fine and consistent exemplary work, not only education and outreach, but activism. We'll get a chance to see a clip of one of the demos later on in this presentation. But I was glad that Paul had mentioned in an earlier email that, you know, we might acknowledge the economic sanctions against Iraq as we think today about the siege, the blockade, the siege and the bombing of Yemen, and also the terrible repercussions of sanctions against Iran. And so I want to start by telling you a memory I have of having been in Baghdad, Iraq. It was during a time when we were pretty sure military war was coming, but economic war had, as Paul mentioned, been waged since 1996 in that country. And civilians all throughout the country were feeling it. And we often tried to meet with the young people and hear what they were trying to say. Well, I went to a high school run by Dominican sisters. They were still able to operate their high school for young women. And a physics teacher invited me to come and meet with the young women. And as we were going up the stairs to the classroom, she said, well, I have to tell you, these girls are really angry. And I thought, well, as well they should be. And it's good that I was sort of forewarned. The girls were furious. And one of them stood up and she said, you come and you say you will do, meaning our group saying we wanted to try and end the sanctions. And she said, but nothing changes. And then she said, me, I am 16. Can you tell me what is the difference between me, I am 16, and someone she is 16 in your country? I'll tell you. Our emotions are frozen, she said. We cannot feel. And then she sat down and actually she began to cry. She could feel, and she was feeling overwhelmed and frustrated. But her friends then stood up and kind of backed her up and said, who are the criminals? Is it the children, our younger brothers and sisters who don't have enough to eat? Is it the people dying in the hospitals? Is it our grandmothers who cry every night? Are they the criminals? And of course, it kept bringing the question up, if you ask who were the criminals during that time, it was the United States. And yet, so few people had any idea about the economic sanctions against Iraq and the hundreds of thousands of children who died as a direct result of those economic sanctions. And I believe that that's very much continuing now when we think about Yemen and Iran. You know, there's one kind of not exactly a silver lining, but a glimmer that gives me quite a lot of hope. A young woman I met first when she was actually a girl of 8 years of age in Baghdad has been in touch with me recently, and she's now grown up. She's a law student. I met her at her grade school, but she said that that day when voices came to her school was one of the only happy days in her entire childhood that she remembers. And she's now co-editing a human rights newsletter, trying to draw attention to human rights violations all around the world. So that's a piece of good news about somebody who is editing a human rights newsletter. But I also want to tell you that last week, I was in touch quite often over the course of the week with an editor of a very fine progressive magazine in the United States. And he was helping edit an article of mine. And he said, you know, I watch cable news 2 to 3 hours a night. He said, never, ever do I hear about what you're writing about with regard to Yemen. I never hear about all of this suffering. And isn't that the case in our country, that we just don't hear, we don't learn, we don't know the stories of people? So I'd like to begin time with you this evening by telling a few stories that come from Yemen. And I've learned these through some very, very good reporters. And this is also one point of positive thought that we can offer. The New York Times Magazine and several extremely talented New York Times correspondents and photographers have gone over to Yemen and have covered some stories which certainly bear plenty of reflection. And so the one that it's really on my mind all the time, it comes from a town in a remote area of Yemen. It was deep inside the territory controlled by the Houthi, but it wasn't a particularly political place. It was a place, the town was called Arhab, where people were suffering from drought, very, very serious drought. They didn't have water to feed their flocks. They didn't have water for irrigation for their plants. And what were they going to do? So they finally did something exemplary. They decided to take a risk, pool their resources, and jointly hire a rig to try and dig for water. They dug and they dug for 2 weeks, nothing. Then the rig broke. Then they had another mishap. They began to wonder if maybe they'd been conned. But finally, after 6 weeks, eureka, one night they hit water. And so the town villagers were exultant, and they danced and they sang. And it got to be the wee hours of the morning, well after midnight. And what they couldn't know was that hovering above them was a warplane sold to Saudi Arabia by the United States and equipped with a bomb manufactured by Raytheon called the Paveway. And the Paveway bomb is quite an efficient weapon. It's the size of a compact car, and it drops out of the warplane. And of course, the Saudi warplane was using intelligence support from the United States. But once it is dangling in the air, and then by virtue of its weight, it detaches from the wire that's attaching it to the plane, then all of a sudden the bomb wakes up and 3 fins jut out, and the laser guided system is able to guide the bomb even though it is 9 miles away from its target and 40,000 feet up in the air. This bomb the size of a compact car starts to go right to the chosen target, and the chosen target was exactly the spot where the revelers, celebrating having found water, were just beginning to bid farewell and goodnight to one another. And then the bomb hit. It hit the ground, and once that bomb explodes, then there's a detonation of 100 pounds of TNT explosive. And this means that the exploding bomb is sending steel shards that go flying through the air at a rate of 8 times the speed of sound. So if one of those shards hits you, you're very unlikely to survive. But also there are waves of air coming from the bomb that travel at enormous speeds. And just the bursts of air can rip limbs apart from torsos. People become, with the shards flying and the bursts of air, decapitated, disemboweled. Their bodies are rearranged. It's an utter horrid nightmare. Out in an area where, if there are survivors, how will they ever get to a hospital? This is a remote area. If they get to a hospital, can they count on first aid, prostheses, surgery? It's all nightmarish. And these are people who meant the United States people no harm. But it's our weapon being used against them. The next morning, there were people who weren't quite sure what had happened, so they went out to the bombing site. And they were curious. Maybe some of them had relatives who hadn't come back from the party. And then there were children who were always extra curious, and they went running ahead and couldn't be restrained. And then the bomb came again. The warplanes flew, and the bombing went on for another 2.5 hours. People said that they were diving into the fields trying to escape. They felt like they were almost being chased by these weapons. 41 people were killed. A somewhat similar event happened in a small remote town in Yemen on January 29th of 2017. Only this time it was an American helicopter that was in pursuit of somebody presumed to be part of Al-Qaeda in the Arab Peninsula. And if the United States believes that there's anybody in a terrorist group that the US has declared to be terrorist, they go in after that person without needing to declare war, or certainly they don't ask permission. So it was 1 o'clock in the morning, and a United States Navy SEAL group in their helicopter landed in the village and was doing a night raid, going into a house to try to find the person they wanted to either kill or capture. And it went wrong for the Navy SEALs. Other villagers heard the commotion. They came with their rifles. They disabled the helicopter pretty quickly. And so the Navy SEALs found themselves under fire, and they called in air support. The air support came and started to lob missiles into little huts in the village. And in one hut, there was a woman named Fahim Mohsin, 30 years old, and she was huddled in her hut with her sister, and together there were 13 children of theirs together. And Fahim didn't know what to do. A missile tore into where they lived, and did she stay or guide the children outside? And she chose the latter. She had her infant in her arms. She was holding her toddler by the hand, and they started to walk outside. And as soon as she was outside, the helicopter had aimed its gun at her, and she was killed immediately. And that story was told by her 5-year-old son, who witnessed it. He walked out behind her, and he told the story to Iona Craig, a very brave reporter now working with the BBC. There are 2 more voices I want to call attention to. One is someone who has been part of your webinar in the past, Professor Shireen Al-Ademi, who teaches at the University of Southern Michigan. And Professor Al-Ademi is herself from Yemen, as is her friend and colleague, Dr. Aisha Juman, who is an epidemiologist born and raised in Yemen, but now living in Seattle. And these are 2 people who, along with Hassan Al-Tayyab from Friends for Committee on National Legislation, work every day trying to get the truth out to people about what they perceive to be happening in Yemen. And they aren't partisans for any particular group, but they do recognize the terrible double standards that are functioning in the policy of the United States toward Yemen. And they also recognize that the combination of the blockade and the bombing is completely lethal and violating every kind of United Nations law about when it's plausible to talk about a war. Well, I can't even say a legal war. I think it's an oxymoron. But I want to say a little bit about this blockade. since 2015, and with the support of the United States, when under President Obama, these ships were sold to the Saudis called LCS ships, littoral combat ships. They can go up along the side of a coastline and help enforce a blockade. The Saudis have been systematically preventing Yemenis from getting basic things that any country needs to survive. Now, 70% of Yemen's population lives in the area now controlled by the Houthi. So when there was a decision made, there will be no more air transport into the Sana'a airport. All seaports will be closed. All land access will be blocked. This meant that the people living under the Houthi control, 70% of the population, were under a state of siege. Now, it should be noted that one of the first places the Saudis bombed when they decided to intervene in what was a conflict already being waged in Yemen was a sewage and sanitation plant. And next to it was the electrical facility upon which it was completely dependent in order to function. So for the city of Sana'a, you basically put out of commission sewage and sanitation for thousands and thousands of people. Well, that was the beginning of the epidemic of cholera. And this has claimed so many lives already. Then the Saudis began to bomb fisheries, food storage places, roadways, factories, schools, hospitals, and all the while insisting that goods that were desperately needed couldn't be allowed in without a long inspection process at the port of Hodeidah. And this meant that the United Nations verification and inspection mission was scouring every nook and cranny of ships that were bringing in desperately needed goods in order to see, are there any weapons there? Now, meanwhile, at the same time, when the United Nations is helping to enforce a state of siege against Yemen, the United States monthly is sending, and still is, sending shiploads of weaponry, and not rifles and bullets, but very sophisticated paveway weapons like the one that I just described, laser-guided munitions coming from Chicago. They've purchased from the Boeing Corporation cruise missiles called the SLAM-ER missiles. The kinds of weapons coming from Canada included the MRAP, the mine-resistant anti-personnel tanks. There's a huge supply of weapons, making huge profits for Boeing, for General Dynamics, for Lockheed Martin, and for Raytheon. And never is a word said about whether or not the Saudis have a right to continue to bomb a country which is now on the brink of famine, one of the poorest countries in the world, and a country wherein we now hear that by the end of the year, there could be 2.4 million children at risk of starvation. That's a kind of torture. So Shireen Al-Ademi and Aisha Juman and Hassan Al-Tayyab talk a lot about the double standards in terms of the imposition of this state of siege. And they also talk about the double standard in terms of weaponry, the kinds of weapons that Saudis have access to and use all the time, and what the Houthis are bringing in, possibly with support of Iran, although that hasn't always been proven. Now, it is true that the Houthis were able yesterday, apparently, to shoot down with a ballistic missile, I think, a drone. And it turned out the drone, although it had the markings of a Saudi plane, was actually a United States manufactured drone. So the other thing that Shireen and Aisha say is that you can't all side this war as though all sides are equally responsible, because that's just not true. The United States, in its support, along with the United Kingdom and other Western countries, for a very strong Saudi coalition, inclusive of the United Arab Emirates and Kuwait and Sudan, Egypt, these groups have ganged up on the Yemenis, the Houthis, are quite desperate now. I mean, if they give up, if they give in, We have to also remember that there are notorious clandestine prisons where people who are picked up by the United Arab Emirates or by Saudi militias are tortured gruesomely. And we should also acknowledge that a predictable consequence of war, when the stakes get to be so high, people become increasingly desperate. And so the Houthi now also have clandestine places where they imprison people and apparently torture them. The Houthi have also started to blockade some of the distribution of relief supplies. This is true. They've said you have to pay a certain tax, or you're not going to allow the supplies to go through. Or maybe they don't like the end recipients and they slow down the passage of supplies. We should acknowledge that, but it's all something that I would lay at the door of the people who are the war profiteering prolongers, people who have exacerbated this war. And that includes people in the United States State Department. It seems to me that we do have a responsibility here in the United States to make sure that people know how the weapons that the United States is equipping the Saudis with are being used, and make sure they know how they're being created. And so, as I said, I've been quite grateful to the campaign that's focused on Raytheon, and I hope that it will be okay to show a clip. It's just a 1 minute, 50-second clip of the people in Boston who were outdoors with social distancing, wearing masks, and successfully, I think, reaching out to the public. Brian, would we be able to show that clip now? Thank you.
Today in Waltham, Massachusetts, protesting against Raytheon. Now, Raytheon is a major company in Massachusetts and is now, after its recent merger, the second largest war profiteer in the world. And they're based right here in Massachusetts. Today, we're in particular focusing on the war in Yemen. Now, most people in this country maybe have heard of Yemen a little bit, probably couldn't put it to it on a map. It's right south of Saudi Arabia, and it's the poorest country in the Middle East. And Raytheon's bombs are daily falling on Yemen. For the last 2 years, the statistic has been that 18 million people in Yemen are on the verge of famine and starvation. That's 18 million out of a population of 28 million. But the Raytheon bombs have been falling on journalists and activists who have been reporting on the ground about these deaths. These bombs have fallen on children, they've fallen on schools, they've fallen on water treatment plants, on hospitals, they've fallen on even people going out in funeral processions to mourn the death of their loved ones. Raytheon knows this is going on. In fact, when the war in Yemen began in 2015, Raytheon stocks shot up. Likewise, at the beginning of this year, in 2020, when the US almost went to war with Iran, Raytheon stocks shot up. You know, they're in the business of death and destruction. They know it, that's what they profit off of. And we think this is really, quite frankly, outrageous. That there's a company anywhere in the world, but also right here in Massachusetts, in Waltham, that's making so much money off of things like famine and starvation, and quite frankly, even genocide.
I think complacence is not an option. Being complicit in our complacence is not an option. We have to take a stand for the people of Yemen, because Yemen cannot wait.
Well, thank you, Brian. And you know, about a week ago, the chief executive officer of the Boeing Corporation, which is headquartered in Chicago, was on a talk show, and he said that he believes that Boeing's defense industry won't change in a time of pandemic or in relation to whomever might become the next president of the United States. He said no matter which administration is running the United States is always committed to defending the country. And so Boeing's profits wouldn't be altered. And I think we need to take a good look at what that means in terms of defending the United States by selling weaponry to Saudi Arabia. Boeing is manufacturing 1,000 cruise missiles for sale to Saudi Arabia. Boeing is also manufacturing Harpoon weapon systems and many, many other weapons that are sold to Israel. And you know, how does this defend the United States? Israel has at least 80 thermonuclear bombs. It's a country that has caused tremendous destabilization within the Middle East and hideous persecution of people, particularly living in Gaza. And so I think we have to hold people accountable who are the spokespersons for major corporations and start to be very vigorous in the kinds of questions we ask. Just how are you and your company and the product you make defending anybody? And then what about the effect of that product on people, for instance, in Yemen? And I suppose one story that will be on our minds very much as we approach August 9th will be the one that occurred tragically 2 years ago when a Lockheed Martin weapon hit a school bus with children who were being rewarded because they'd gone to their summer school classes and they were going on a picnic and they were so excited. And they even took cell phone selfies of themselves that survived the bombing. And 42 children on the school bus were hit by a direct laser-guided Lockheed Martin manufactured bomb. Those children certainly weren't enemies who posed any threat whatsoever to people in the United States. I think it's important to try and understand how it is that the State Department, for instance, justifies its relationship to Saudi Arabia. And so often it's put in the context of the United States' responsibility to link up with other countries that will help the United States contain Iran, because Iran is the great danger. Well, you know, again, I want to mention Israel has at least 80 thermonuclear weapons. Iran, no nuclear weapon. The United States has by now kind of green-lighted 7 procedures so that the Saudis can begin to work on developing nuclear energy, and that puts it in that category where the country of Saudi Arabia could develop a nuclear weapon, and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has been very clear. If the Iranians get the nuclear weapon, we will get a nuclear weapon. So this doesn't make the world a safer place. But also, in fairness, you know, if you look at the budget of the country of Iraq for their military spending, their entire budget would be spent in 15 days of United States military spending. And also, thinking geographically, Iran is surrounded by no less than 45 United States military bases and forward operating bases. If you were to say, well, aren't the Iranians meddling in affairs in the region? Well, aren't the United States troops and policies meddlesome in terms of the affairs of the region? Iran's an oil-producing country, and since the imposition of the economic sanctions against Iran, their petrodollars have plummeted. They used to, before President Trump walked away from the joint the joint plan of comprehensive action, the Iranians were selling about 250,000 barrels of oil per day. And now it's down to just a vastly smaller number, just a few, forgive me, they were selling 2.5 million barrels of oil per day. And now they're just selling a couple 100,000 barrels of oil per day. So this cuts into their ability to supply health care, to maintain government systems, and particularly now with the spread of COVID, it has been devastating for the country. Iran has had the highest number of deaths from the pandemic in the region, and then we just learned today that they probably have undercounted. For what reason, I'm not sure, but it seems like it's more likely that 43,000 people at least have died because of the pandemic in Iran. And this also means that people who are from neighboring Afghanistan become terrified that maybe they'll become infected with the virus. And so they start heading across the border back into Afghanistan. And this no doubt is carrying the virus further and further into Afghanistan, which has a healthcare system completely in shambles. Again, there is the double standard. Iran has poured cement into the reactors that were going to possibly be used someday to create plutonium. They have cooperated with every demand of the International Atomic Energy Association until very recently. And you know, the United States, nevertheless, refuses to acknowledge that Israel has 80 thermonuclear weapons and continues to say that Iran is the great threat to the region and the sanctions must be imposed because of Iran's policies with regard to nuclear weapons, even though the United States basically ripped up the treaty that it took years to negotiate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. It certainly is my belief that the United States should lift those sanctions. I hope that in future US administrations that would be an immediate priority, but of course we would have to insist and be very vigilant about insisting on that in the event that there is a Democratic administration in the White House. I want to just hold up the magazine that has been affecting me a great deal in the last couple of days. This is an article by Bill McKibben. It appeared in the New York Review of Books, and it's entitled 130 Degrees, and it's about our final warning, 6 Degrees of Climate Emergency, a book by Mark Linus. And in it, Bill McKibben lays out the terrible threat that we now face. I mean, I think it's inarguable. The greatest threat we all face is the threat of what we're doing to our own environment. And we can't possibly cope as a civilization, as a society in the United States, with the great tasks necessary in order to deal with climate change and climate catastrophe and still maintain the military-industrial complex that simply gobbles up so much of this country's resource and ingenuity and capacity to solve problems. We cannot keep the militarism going, and we can't pretend that that is really defending people in the United States in terms of the very real threats we face, not only with pandemic, very obviously right now, but certainly with regard to climate catastrophe. So I think it becomes ever more important to educate, to keep on trying to reach people, to make demands of legislators, to go into the universities, into the schools as much as possible, into the faith-based communities, and certainly to be out on the streets. There's a very fine letter that people could sign on to right now. It's a cease and desist letter. I like that language, cease and desist, directed to Raytheon. And you know, I know that the heads of these corporations are responsible to their stockholders. They, by law, I suppose, have to try to make a profit for the stockholders, but they also have a public image. And so it's our job to let it be known what it is that these companies create. So thanks, Brian. That's the letter. And I think, is there a link for how people can sign that letter? I may be in the chat. Oh, thank you, Brian. Yeah, it's in the chat section. So I also, knowing that Peace Action and the Raytheon campaign have worked very closely with the Cambridge Friends meeting, I'd like to close my remarks by thinking about a very gentle, a very kindly line. It's a good bookend to what I heard from those young girls who were so frustrated in Iraq. And this is from Jonathan Woolman. He said, a Quaker, he said, "Trod gently over all the earth, trod gently over all the earth, seeing that of God in everyone and everything." And I can't begin to pretend that I would know anything about what it means to see God But I think maybe we could, in our poor language, use the word dignity. Seeing the dignity of every human person and of every being on earth, and then strive to trod gently. So I'll be looking forward to your questions, comments, ideas, criticisms, both in this webinar, and if anybody wanted to get in touch with me in the future, and if Google decides that I can come out again, I'm on timeout with Google because I overextended my storage vastly. But Kathy at bcnv.org if anyone wanted to get in touch.
Paul, you just have to unmute yourself. And there
So
you go.
would welcome questions. If you go to the participants panel, halfway down, you'll see on the bottom menu there is one say raise hand. And if you're interested in asking Kathy a question, please hit that button and a little hand will go up next to your name. It looks like we have a few questions coming in already. Moji Aga, would you like to ask Kathy a question? Brian, could we unmute Moji?
Sure, just one moment. Isn't technology wonderful, everyone? It's not allowing me to. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty here. My apologies.
Okay, let's take another minute here, see if that can work. If not, we'll transition to the chat.
Okay, I do believe I have Moji now.
Okay, let's see how this works.
Oh, hi. Do you hear my voice?
Yes, we
I
do.
can hear you.
Wonderful. Kathy, thank you. You are one of the best storytellers as a peace activist I have seen over the decades I've been an activist. So thank you for telling a story in such a way that one can actually be there because your heart has been there. So as I'm an Iranian American peace and human rights and justice and interfaith dialogue activist, as Kathy knows, and maybe some of others among you. And I want to, being Iranian American and a reformist and nonviolence activist, I want to seek Kathy's comments regarding this particular relationship that I have to deal with people inside Iran who are really angry at imposition of a particular reading of a religious doctrine on the country. And they are really angry to the point of even saying that maybe Trump should come and rescue us. So it crushes my heart every time I hear Iranians inside Iran who are so pressed by sanctions, genocidal sanctions in a COVID environment, especially now, to think that somebody called Trump and Netanyahu can come and rescue Iran. Now, what I am seeing is a relationship between internal despotism. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh was Iran's prime minister in 1953. He was overthrown by the CIA, as I'm sure all of you folks know. And he said at that time, internal despotism and external colonialism are two sides of the same coin. At the time, the Shah of Iran, US puppet, and Nixon or Eisenhower were the external colonial powers. They needed each other directly, like today, Bin Salman and Trump Netanyahu. They need each other directly, of course, in an unequal situation as master and slave, but nonetheless, they need each other directly. What is happening in Iran is that the unelected part of Iran's government, which are called the regime, needs external colonialism as enemy and vice versa. They need each other as enemy. And so therefore they reinforce one another. And I'm sure you, Kathy, understand this kind of dynamic. So I would like you to comment how Iranians are inside Iran, including my family. I come from Natanz, the city, the town of Natanz, where Iran's enrichment facility is located. And so please talk to the dilemma that people of Iran are stuck in. On the one hand, the internal despots are oppressing them horribly, imposing, draconian religious, so-called religious laws.
Moji, I'm just going to jump in here. I think we have a lot of people online, and I think Kathy gets the flavor of your question, and I'd like to give her a chance to respond.
Please talk to this dynamic. Sorry that I took so long.
It's okay.
Sorry.
Well, Moji, I'm surely thinking about your family members and you, and how very hard this must be. And it's repetitive again and again. And it's just exactly what you laid out, that when people are treated as people who are subjects, who don't have the right to reach out beyond where they live and get education and continue to learn what's happening outside of their immediate world, eventually it's almost like they're living in a dungeon. And if you really, really wanted to enable a group of people to overthrow a repressive government, then the things you'd need to do would be to strengthen the education, to strengthen international connections, and certainly strengthen social services. But what sanctions do is debilitate social services. So people get so frustrated, and who are they going to blame? They don't see anybody outside their country because they're not allowed to have a focus outside the country. And so it tends to build a greater and greater frustration with the actual government, but not a frustration equipped with the ability to overthrow that government. People become debilitated. In Iraq, they spoke about feeling hollowed out. So I think these economic sanctions are a cruel and a wicked tactic, and I'm sorry for what it's doing to your own relatives in Natanz, both economically, but also in terms of their own geopolitical perspective. But I think it then redounds on us to redouble our efforts to end these economic sanctions and to try as best as we can to reach the people who are most affected and help them understand the history of how imperial powers like the United States have treated people in other lands when they want to plunder those lands, take their resources, or possibly give support to even more dangerous neighbors within the region. And in this case, I'd say Saudi Arabia and Israel.
Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Moji. The next question is from David and Jan Hatzo.
Thank you, Kathy.
Oh, wait. Okay, good. You're free. You're open. Good.
Thank you, Kathy, for your powerfully telling the truth about the horrors of what the United States is doing in Yemen and Iran. My question is, during the 80s, when the U.S. was supplying the bombs and weapons for killing people in Central America, we formed what we called Nuremberg Actions, where we actually with our bodies blocked the trains carrying bombs to ships which were going to Central America. And we blocked every train for 2.5 years. So the government would have to arrest sometimes up to 50 of us for each time a train would carry bombs to kill our brothers and sisters in Central America. So my question to you and perhaps others in Peace Action there, or other parts of the country as well, whether in response to this horror of supplying the weapons that are killing and threatening with starvation hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people, whether we could do something like we did in Nuremberg Actions and say, this cannot continue with our silence. We have to get in the way of these bombs reaching the destination.
Well, David and Jan, your entire life has been an encyclopedia in a sense of this kind of action and determination. Thank you so, so much. You know, I think we should be very international right now in our focus on Saudi Arabia, because right now there hasn't been a specific US port which has been able to block the departure of any of the Bahri shipping lines that do depart from the port in North Carolina called the Wilmington port, and also from the port of Baltimore. There are activists at the port of Baltimore with signs, but it hasn't been possible to get to the actual shoreline and block the ship's departure. But in France, in Spain, in Italy, activists have either directly affected the unions so that they say, we're not going to load anything on that ship, we're not going to offload anything from that ship, we're not going to help that ship dock in the harbor. And the ships have had to go on to the next port. They've also gone into their courts, and the UK has done this as well, and tried to say legally that the country cannot service these ships because the Saudis are involved in war crimes. In Canada, much to their credit, up in north of Buffalo, but in Canada, they asked the people in Buffalo, keep your eyes open for a train that's going to be coming to bring these mine-resistant anti-personnel weapons. They're like big tanks, and they're outfitted with skirts that are supposed to make them mine-resistant. Those are going to be traveling through the United States, presumably to the port of Baltimore, because our activists prevented them from being serviced while they were in the port in St. John's and in, I believe, near London, Ontario. Sorry, I'm not sure about my geography there. But anyway, the Canadians have put up some resistance, and so they had to send that shipment of weapons down through the United States, and unfortunately it hasn't been tracked. But David, what you're suggesting I think is so important. Voices had planned in September to do a walk from Green Bay, Wisconsin up to Marinette, Wisconsin, and that's where these naval warships, very lethal warships, are being produced that are going to be sold to the Saudis. And so it was our intent to do a civil disobedience action there. But with the pandemic, we haven't been as able to organize that. But this doesn't relieve us of the responsibility to keep inspiring and keep collaborating with one another, and also to do so internationally.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thanks. So the next, Aaron, can we unmute? There we go. Go ahead, Aaron.
Hi, I just wanted to thank Kathy for this very interesting and moving talk, and also Massachusetts Peace Action, Paul and Anna, and David for putting this together. My question was about sort of the state of play in the U.S. Congress. I know, I kind of lost track of this, I have to admit. About a year or two ago, I know there was some kind of legislation which was done, I think, at the federal level, where they're at least going to say that the U.S. cannot, I think it was cannot send more weapons to Saudi Arabia. Correct me if I'm incorrect, I'm wrong about this. Anyway, I believe that legislation actually passed and then was vetoed by Trump, I'm thinking. So I guess my question is, are there any other attempts happening, you know, on kind of a legislative way, or does anybody know any about legislation that people can support?
Thanks, Aaron. You know, it was kind of amazing to me to realize, gosh, a year and a half has already gone past now since exactly what you're talking about. And it was kind of remarkable that I guess they'd say bicameral in both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, but also bipartisan. Legislation was passed. It was passed into law, but it kind of hit the wall because President Trump said, I'm not going to pass that. And he vetoed it. And they didn't have in the Senate the 2/3 majority that they would need to override the veto. But, you know, in a year and a half's time, legislators have had many months to devise new legislation. I sure have to hand it to Representative Ro Khanna and to all the constituents in his district who continue to push. And then I especially want to note the Friends Committee on National Legislation and Hassan Al-Qayab, who have worked so hard to try to push these legislators and say, okay, you didn't get it through that time, but then it doesn't mean the war has ended. And now here we are with 2.6 million children possibly dying of starvation by the end of the year. What could be more urgent? So I think we have to keep pushing. Unfortunately, the Saudis have hired some very high-powered lobbyists. And these lobbyists just go up and down the halls of Congress. They know who to put pressure on. They, you know, threaten in a sense. If you don't go along with what the Saudis want, then it could be that the factory in your area that's producing weapons or the base in your area that helps create jobs could close. And so they have a vice-like grip, I think, on many people within the Congress. But that's also a sign to us that the Saudis are paying attention to U.S. public opinion. And to, so I think that the more that the Saudis get the sense that, hey, you know, on a grassroots level, a lot of these legislators are getting pushback from people in their own communities who say, we don't like hearing about busloads of children being sacrificed to the plunder that your country wants to enact against the poorest country in one of the poorest countries in the world. So I think it's important to count on our efforts having potential influence even as far away as Saudi Arabia.
Thanks, Kath. We're running a little late, but I want to get in these last three questions if we could. People could ask their questions quickly. Packy, you want to go next?
Sure. Thank you. Thanks, Mass Peace Action, and thank you so much, Kathy, for this. I just want to share this and get some feedback. We've been putting out, I have these signs on the side of my car, sanctions kill and defund military. And people stop and say, oh, is that your card? And one of the things that happens again and again and again is I say, so do you feel more secure? And nobody feels secure. And so I say, well, so what would make you feel secure? Not more weapons, not the weapons that we're using, but healthcare and housing and all those other good things. And so, you know, there's just little drops of water that are wearing away that rock, I hope.
Well, Pocky, Reland, and Code Pink, I'd see you as being on the continuum of things more toward a tsunami than little drops of water. It's been fantastic in consistently calling attention to the consequences of war and standing up to the war makers. But I think that's right, you know, in whatever way, whether it's yard signs or bumper stickers, the public demonstrations, we're holding placards, walks, vigils, it's all very, very needed and important. And then, I mean, I'm also myself impressed truly with what Massachusetts Action has done in combining both the activism and the webinar, the outreach education aspect. But going to Raytheon, and is it August 15th? Is that right? Anna had told us that that's when you're having your next action. And it's good to write that up and give others inspiration to, you know, as in my case, get something organized down at Boeing.
Great. Thanks, Kath. Siddhartha is next.
such a privilege to listen to Kathy Kelly, whom I read about and whom I've read over many years, and to be with like-minded people, more than 100 of us, apparently. I say that because I'm from India. I've been in the US for some time. But I certainly feel very lonely because there's so much apparent indifference to the consequences of American conduct in the world. So for me, this is a very meaningful, very reassuring evening. I'd like to ask a quick question about the anthropology of American conduct, the culture that drives American behavior in the world. I get the feeling, having observed American foreign policy from near and afar for close to 40 years, that America has a hard problem, a very difficult problem, I should say, dealing with countries on a peer-to-peer basis, that is on a basis of equality. The default style, it seems to me, is one of either patronage, or which goes with aid and advice, or aggression. I think as far as China, Iran, and Iraq are concerned, these three countries all represent that part of the world which will not listen to the American diktat, and that creates the hostility that sometimes leads to war. So is this a bipartisan issue, Kathy, a bipartisan problem? That it's a cultural problem, it's not dependent upon party or ideology, that America finds it very difficult to work with other nations except on the basis of a relationship between a patron and the patron's junior partner. Thank you.
Thank you for eloquently holding a mirror up, a mirror for us to see what this exceptionalism that the United States has practiced again and again looks like. It's certainly to our detriment that we presumed that other countries should westernize or modernize, when really that's often a smokescreen for the United States wanting to take their resources at cut rate prices and be able to control the flow of very precious and irreplaceable resources all throughout the world. I think it's a terrible shame that within the United Nations, the Big Five with their veto have been able to maintain a usage of the United Nations that undermines the possibility of ever really achieving the goal of the UN Charter and that wonderful idea that we'll beat our swords into plowshares and our spears into pruning hooks and eliminate the scourge of warfare. But I think that these wars are meant for theft and plunder, and that people in the United States have lived better, comparatively better. Not all the people in the United States, but many have lived better than other people because we've been able to take other people's resources and not even ask any questions about it. And so, of course, China and India should be looking at this period in history and saying, this isn't a time when we have to pay obeisance to the United States. The United States obviously is not able to meet the needs of people even within its own country. When you look at the rates of incarceration, 2 million people minimum incarcerated. When you look at the reflections of racism and police brutality, when you look at the numbers of children who are hungry in this country and the undereducated situation. So I think the United States should be looking to India and looking to China for collaboration, for advice, and certainly in the face of climate catastrophe, we all have to put aside differences and learn to collaborate so that we can look together for the possibility of survival.
Good, Kathy. Thank you. Let's try to squeeze in two more. These are the last two. Mike Levinson. There you go. Go ahead, Mike.
How you doing? Greetings from the War Resisters League.
Hello, Mike Levinson.
Hi. Here in the United States, many people are preoccupied, rightly so, with the human rights violations and abuses against Americans by way of police violence here in our own cities. But people are making the connections between domestic policy and foreign policy. And I'd like to encourage you to continue to encourage people to recognize those connections. Human rights, we're violating human rights here at home, and we're violating them abroad all around the world. And if you go to a lot of these protests or you look at the photographs, you do see many people holding up signs that say things like, Ferguson is Gaza and Gaza is Ferguson, and things like that. So people are making the connections, and we need to continue to do that, to attend these actions and make the connections, and remind people that the domestic policy and foreign policy are two sides of the same coin.
Thank you, Mike. You know, here in Chicago, along the Chicago River, we did a free Gaza flotilla last summer. And one of the chants was, from Palestine to Mexico, all the walls have got to go.
Right on. Right on.
Even in the little restaurants alongside the Riverwalk, people started playing that on the boom boxes. And
that's a popular chant.
Okay, and our last question for tonight comes from one of the main activists in the Raytheon anti-war campaign here in the Boston area. Masade, you want to go ahead?
Yes, hi. Thank you so much, Kathy, for your wonderful talk, very educational. As an Iranian American, I am very concerned about the situation of Iranian people. And since Trump has walked out of the Iran deal, it seems that Democrats are following Trump's line, and there is such an animosity, a deep animosity against Iran. I should say Iranian people, because they are the ones who are suffering. And as an activist, I should say whatever we do, many of us have tried to see the representatives, our representatives, including, I mean Arlington, Massachusetts, and we've been trying to see Catherine Clark and whoever we want to see. They just don't want to even see us. And they really following Trump's line instead of having a position about reinstating the Iran deal, which was signed by Obama, by a Democrat. And you did mention about educating people about your US foreign policy, which is a great point, I agree. What shall we do with these politicians who are not just going to give in? And the animosity, again, I should say, against Iranian people, because they are suffering. I call on Twitter, I read the Iranians, many ordinary Iranians' comments about they all want to come out of the country. I called relatives, they say like 2 salaries come to this family by the 10th of after 10 days of the month, everything is gone. Situation is horrifying there, and I just like you talk about that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, as I had said to Roji, I'm so sorry to think of the suffering that your own family members in Iran are experiencing, and they in no way deserve to be punished and so grievously harmed. I think it is important as best we can to form alliances on the grassroots so that when you would go to an elected representative's office, you know, that you'd be flanked by others who are in solidarity with you. We ought not to go along with the isolation of Iran in any fashion, and not within our own activist circles either. I suppose we could hold out some hope that a new administration might be willing to revisit the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and try to salvage that comprehensive plan. But certainly it would require a lot of effort to begin pressuring, for instance, the Biden campaign now, as soon as possible. Again, I want to turn to Code Pink. They've had delegations of people who've traveled to Iran now several times, and two of my own housemates and colleagues went on that most recent delegation, and they came back, and you know, people are very inclined to kind of hit the ground running. And I know that travel is not so feasible these days, but maybe some things could be done online. I think that Jawad Zarif, the foreign minister of Iran, has made some very intelligent and inspirational statements about statecraft and about diplomacy, and rejecting the idea of bullying and trying to use economic measures to push people into desperation. So thank you, Masuda, for persisting with these questions. I wish that I had more kind of staunch answers, but again, let's keep our mind on David Hertzow, who had asked a question earlier, and David went on one of those trips to Iran. And one of the things he learned is that when he was in quite desperate need of very good health care, the kindness and the hospitality of people in the Iranian medical system saved his life. So let's keep that in mind too.
Great. Well, thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kathy. Anna, do you want to come back on here?
And may I say a special thanks to everybody who participated into Massachusetts Peace Action. I'm very, very grateful for this chance to think together with all of you. And let's act together in solidarity.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy. Well said. Really important for us to come together and unite against these wars. So just want to repeat for everyone, just if people tuned in late or forgot, we have a few actions coming up in the Boston area in Massachusetts. So the first is August 15th, which is a week from this Saturday. We'll be having a rally against Raytheon and its role in the war in Yemen in Davis Square, which is in Somerville, Massachusetts, and that will be at 11 a.m. So that's the first thing. And then the second is we will be having our regular coordinating committee meeting on Monday, August 17th at 5:30 p.m. Eastern time for Massachusetts. And we'll be sending follow-up links for all of this tomorrow. And finally, just in case anyone is interested in the presentation that the campaign has about the campaign, about Yemen, please follow up with us directly and we'll be sure to coordinate with you on that. So thank you everyone so much and have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Thanks everyone.
Thanks very much, Kath.
Ready on.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Kathy.
Namaste.